Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a stack of material exploring the really rich and complex history of Turkish foreign policy.
Yeah, it's quite a collection we've got. Covers a lot of ground from, the theories behind foreign policy analysis, tracing institutions way back, specific events, wars, treaties, all the way to shifts in policy over, well, centuries, really.
Right. And our mission here is to take all this information, pull out the most important pieces, and sort of stitch together the story of how Turkey has engaged with the world, based only on what's in these sources, of course.
Exactly. It's about giving you a shortcut to understanding this fascinating, constantly evolving picture.
We're looking at a huge time frame from the late Ottoman period right through the founding of the Republic, the Cold War, and up into the early 2000s and a bit beyond. Trying to grasp the core ideas, the key players, the moments that really shaped things.
Okay, so where do we start? Well, the sources suggest thinking about foreign policy through different theoretical lenses. They mention things like realism, constructivism, pragmatism, behavioralism.
And realism comes up quite a bit, right? What's the core idea there, according to this material?
Yeah, it's pretty central in some analyses. Basically, the realist view sees the world stage as, well, anarchic. No world government. States are the main actors, and they're primarily driven by self-interest, power, and acting rationally to survive and thrive.
So, not a rosy view of cooperation.
Not inherently, no. The sources say realism doesn't really buy into the idea that human nature naturally leads to peace or cooperation between states. Power balance is key. They also touch on neoclassical realism as a related perspective.
Okay, that's a useful framework to keep in mind. Now, moving from theory to history, the story really kicks off institutionally back in the Ottoman era.
With the rise of Kutupuk.
Exactly. Think of it as a kind of early foreign ministry emerging way back in the 15th century. And as diplomacy got more complex, especially by the 18th, 19th centuries, this institution really had to evolve.
And that late 19th century, that's when European power influence becomes really intense, right? Oh, definitely. You see it clearly with the Treaty of Ayas-Stefano-San Stefano in 1878, after the Russo-Turkish War.
How so?
Well, powers like Britain and Austria-Hungary looked at the terms and panicked a bit. They saw Russia gaining way too much, like access to the Mediterranean through a big Bulgaria that threatened Britain's route to India, and autonomy for Bosnia-Herzegovina blocked Austria-Hungary's expansion plans.
Ah, so that led to pushback.
Immediately, which resulted in the Berlin Treaty just a few months later, same year, 1878. It was basically a revision meant to dial back Russia's gains and, well, somewhat soften the terms for the Ottomans. Bismarck's role is mentioned here.
And was there anything particularly significant in that Berlin Treaty, according to the sources?
Absolutely. Article 61, this was huge. It essentially gave European powers a formal right to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs, specifically about reforms for Armenian populations and ensuring their safety from groups like Circassians and Kurds.
Wow, direct interference.
Yes. And it even led to Britain and Russia making promises about future independence to Armenians, a really major step in eroding Ottoman sovereignty.
And this period also saw actual territory lost through occupation.
It did. The sources list the British taking Cyprus in 1878, Egypt in 1882, and the French grabbing Tunis in 1882. It was a time of serious decline and external pressure.
But there was a different relationship developing with Germany.
Yeah, the material points this out. Starting around Bismarck's time and lasting until World War I, Germany seemed less interventionist, showed more respect for Ottoman territorial integrity compared to the others. That fostered a kind of special relationship for a while.
Then came the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913. The sources describe these as critical.
Critical and devastating. A major step towards the final collapse in WWI. And these weren't just regional squabbles. European powers, especially Russia, were involved. The Ottoman army, despite having, according to the sources, superior equipment, suffered a massive defeat.
Leading to loss of territory.
Huge losses. Most of the remaining Balkan territories were gone, and the psychological impact, the demoralization, was apparently profound and lasting.
Okay, let's touch on the Armenian issue again.
Yeah.
The sources seem to emphasize it wasn't just a WWI phenomenon.
Right. They state that European powers had been interested and, frankly, using the issue for interference since the 1870s. Stefanos Article 16 mentioned reforms and security for Armenians.
And during WWI itself, what do the sources say happened?
The account in this material is that following attacks and massacres carried out by Armenian nationalist groups and committees, the Ottoman state ordered deportations. The term used is sürgün.
Okay, and the conditions of these deportations.
Well, the sources claim that efforts were made for safe travel, but they also acknowledge that given the harsh conditions of wartime and public reactions to the earlier violence by Armenian nationalists, people did die. Crucially, the texts assert there was no systematic state decision aimed at causing death, and that travel was managed as safely as possible under very difficult circumstances. That's the perspective presented here.
Got it. Okay, so the empire collapses, War of Independence, and we move into the early Republican era. The key principle mentioned is statu quo, maintaining the status quo.
Exactly, statu quo. And the reasons given in the sources make sense. First, a clear decision not to try and reclaim lost imperial lands. No more expansionism. Second, it was a reaction against the policies of the previous regime, the Ittihad ve Taraqi, which were blamed for dragging the empire into ruin.
And just sheer exhaustion, I imagine.
Definitely. Years and years of constant war. Plus, the sources also mention contextual factors like the perceived threat from the new Soviet Union and the fact that Turkish communities existed within the USSR's borders, reasons to sort of consolidate and focus inward, maintain the existing state.
And the defining document of this era, establishing the new state, is the Treaty of Lausanne.
Absolutely fundamental. It set the modern borders and really cemented Turkey's sovereignty.
What were some key outcomes detailed in the sources? Borders first.
Right. The Maris River became the border with Greece, keeping Edirne in Turkey. For the islands, Imroz, Bozcaada, and Gökçeada went to Turkey, vital for the security of the straits.
And the Greek islands.
The northern Aegean ones, like Limni, Sakuz, Midilli, etc., went to Greece. But, and this is important on the condition they remain demilitarized. The Dodecanese Islands, the 12 islands, which Italy had taken earlier, were also eventually given to Greece.
What else did Turkey give up?
It formally renounced claims over Egypt, Sudan, Cyprus acknowledging British control there, and perhaps most crucially for sovereignty, the capitulations were completely abolished. No more special legal rights for foreigners.
That's a huge step. What about the Mosul border issue, that oil-rich region?
That was tricky. Lausanne postponed it, saying it should be settled within 9 months, potentially involving the League of Nations if direct talks failed. The borders with the Soviets and Iran were pretty much left as they were.
And minorities. That's always a complex part of these treaties.
Yes. Article 38 is highlighted. It guaranteed basic rights, life, liberty for everyone in Turkey, no discrimination based on birth, nationality, language, race, religion, freedom of worship, public and private, as long as it didn't disrupt public order.
And specific guarantees for non-Muslim minorities.
Equal political rights, education rights, freedom of worship. And importantly, the sources note these rights were mirrored for the Muslim minorities living in Greece, a principle of reciprocity.
Okay, moving forward then into the WWII era. Hizmet İnönü is president from 38 to 50. How is his foreign policy described?
The term used is tedbirli ve temkin duruş, a cautious and prudent stance. Less active, less autonomous perhaps than Ataturk's time or what came after 1950.
Why caution?
Part of it, the sources suggest, was internal politics. İnönü consolidating his power after Ataturk's death, maybe lacking that same unique charisma he needed to secure his footing. But also the huge factor was the international situation war was brewing, then exploding across Europe.
But the basic direction set by Ataturk continued.
The core axis, yes. But İnönü applied it more cautionally. There was also a big emphasis, apparently, on economic development being just as important as political independence, even though money remained tight.
How did Turkey navigate the war itself? The sources mention interactions with the Allies.
Yeah, a delicate balancing act. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Churchill really wanted Turkey to jump in. But Stalin, interestingly, wasn't pushing for it then, maybe because the Soviets were already gaining ground. Still, the Allies kept pressing Turkey to join by early 44.
And the Yalta Conference in 45.
That was about the post-war order, setting up the UN. The price of admission to the founding conference in San Francisco was declaring war on Germany and Japan by March 1st, 1945.
So Turkey declared war.
It did, cut ties with Germany in August 44, then declared war on the Axis February 23rd, 1945, just in time to be a founding UN member. A pragmatic move.
How did the Soviets react to that late declaration?
According to the material, they weren't impressed. Saw it as too little, too late, wanting all the credit themselves for pushing back the Germans. But Turkey felt it had secured its place in the post-war structure, backed by US and UK assurances.
And this is where we see that major pivot, right? The post-war shift towards the West, driven primarily by
the Soviet threat. Absolutely central, according to these sources. The USSR terminating the 1925 Friendship Treaty was seen as a clear signal. removed territories in the east ceded in 1921 when the Soviets were weaker, and they wanted new privileges, essentially control, over the Turkish Straits, a vital strategic waterway.
Were these demands discussed internationally?
At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, yes. But crucially, the US and UK didn't concede. Their strategy was to delay, frame it as an international issue involving many countries, not just a bilateral Soviet-Turkish matter. They basically signaled support for Turkey against what they saw as a clear threat.
And Soviet pressure continued.
It did. They installed a socialist regime in neighboring Bulgaria, really tightening the screws. A Soviet note in September 46 led to a very strong Turkish response. Prime Minister Recep Paker prioritized independence, and President İnönü famously declared Turkey wouldn't yield an inch of land. We will die as honorable people.
A clear line in the sand. Was there a decisive U.S. signal of support?
A very powerful symbolic one. In April 1946, the USS Missouri, a massive battleship, brought the body of the Turkish ambassador Münir Ertegun home to Istanbul. It wasn't subtle. Everyone understood it as a message to Moscow. The U.S. stands with Turkey. İnönü even visited the ship.
Wow. And tangible support followed.
Yes. The U.S. waived Turkey's Lend-Lease debts in May 46, and President Truman publicly declared support for Turkey against the Soviet demands in August 46.
Which leads us to the Truman Doctrine.
Exactly. Announced July 1947, formalized military and economic aid specifically to Turkey and Greece to counter the Soviet threat, mostly seen as military aid initially to build up their strength.
And the Marshall Plan, how did that fit in?
That was broader economic aid. The European Recovery Plan launched June 47. Turkey signed its agreement in July 48. The aid focused on agriculture mainly and was supervised by U.S. officials, but the sources say it definitely helped agricultural and economic development, and importantly, it increased the flow of U.S. goods, U.S. cultural influence.
So this aid package, Truman and Marshall, really pulled Turkey into the Western orbit.
Undeniably, it cemented the Atlantic-oriented policy. And interestingly, the sources link this foreign policy shift to domestic changes too, supporting democratic development and the consolidation of the multi-party system, foreign policy influencing internal politics.
Makes sense. And NATO membership became the ultimate goal for security.
Absolutely vital in İnönü's view. The CHP government under him made the first application in May 1950.
But it wasn't immediately successful.
No, rejected twice initially. Then came the Menderes government, the Democrat Party, DP. They made a critical decision, highlighted in the sources, sending troops to the Korean War in July 1950.
How many troops?
4,500 soldiers. And significantly, the sources note this was done initially without getting Parliament's formal approval. It was seen as a strategic gamble to prove Turkey's commitment to the free world, the Western Bloc, and sway the U.S. Congress.
Did it work? Did the Korean deployment help?
Apparently, yes. Turkish soldiers fought bravely, joined the U.S. 25th Division. Their stand at Kanuri, preventing a potential rout, is mentioned as creating a very positive impression in the U.S., showcasing their commitment and fighting ability.
And that paved the way for membership.
It seems so. Turkey officially joined NATO on February 18, 1952, a major milestone.
Okay, so let's look closer at that Menderes DP period, 1950 to 1960. The policy is described as Amerika Yanlısı Dış Politika.
Pro-American foreign policy, yes. But the sources add a nuance. It was seen primarily as a tool for achieving economic prosperity and development, not necessarily driven by a deep ideological alignment. They even mentioned the DP considered turning to Moscow later if things went sour with the U.S.
But the U.S. relationship became dominant.
Fundamentally shaped everything, yeah. The sources call it an irreversible process. U.S. relations were the main agenda item, influencing all other foreign policy moves.
Is there a sense of the official rhetoric from that time?
The material quotes statements emphasizing the alliance with the UK-France, the closest friendship with the US, respect for all nations' independence, peaceful intentions, and gratitude for Truman-Marshall aid as vital for peace. Standard diplomatic language, but clearly prioritizing the US link.
What about how foreign policy was made during this time? Any institutional shifts?
Yes, some interesting points. Parliament, the TBMM, apparently debated foreign policy more, and the opposition was quite vocal. The foreign ministry was also prominent, with key figures like Fuat Köprülü and Fatih Rüştü Zorlu, so more actors involved than before, although Parliament was sometimes bypassed, like with the Korea decision initially.
And the military's role?
This is crucial. After the 1960 coup, the military's influence dramatically increased. through new bodies like the National Security Council, MGK, and the National Unity Committee. They became key players in defining the national interests.
And public opinion.
That also became a factor for the first time, really. Especially around the Cyprus issue, you started seeing anti-American sentiments emerge. Foreign policy lost its kind of untouchable above parties status. It became part of the public debate.
Now, those close U.S. ties had very concrete consequences, like military bases.
Huge consequences. The military facilities agreement allowed the U.S. to set up extensive defense facilities. The sources mention a total of 92.
92, wow. And that led to issues.
Big issues over sovereignty. The text highlights the controversial point that U.S. military personnel, and even other U.S. citizens sometimes, weren't subject to Turkish law but U.S. jurisdiction. The Yarbe-Morrison case in 1959 is cited as an example.
That sounds like it would cause friction.
It did. Plus, tax exemptions for U.S. military goods and personnel property. These became major domestic political headaches, especially by the mid-60s. They fueled calls from the growing political left for full independence and stoked anti-American feelings.
And Turkey got drawn into Cold War flashpoints because of these bases.
Directly, the U.S. placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Adana, which were a key factor in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And remember, the U-2 incident. The American spy plane shot down over the Soviet Union. It took off from Incirlik base near Adana, made Turkey a direct target.
So these agreements were eventually changed.
They were revised in 1967, yeah. The whole setup was complex and causing too much tension.
The sources also mention this strong U.S. alignment affected other relationships.
Yes, particularly with the non-aligned movement. Turkey's close ties with the U.S. limited its engagement there. And Arab countries were apparently concerned about the U.S. bases and plans like the Middle East Command Project.
Okay, let's pivot to the Cyprus issue, which really starts to escalate in the mid-50s. What kicked it off, according to the sources?
They point to the formation of EOK in 1955, described as a terrorist organization led by Greek Colonel Grievous. Its explicit goal was a gnosis union of Cyprus with Greece.
And this led to violence.
Yes, aimed at achieving a gnosis, but also causing Turkish Cypriots to flee mixed villages between 55 and 58. The situation got so bad, the British, still the colonial power, declared a state of emergency.
Was there an attempt to resolve this internationally?
The London Conference in 1955. Britain wanted to protect its own interests, but also calm things down between its NATO allies Turkey and Greece. Britain defended its sovereignty, but also floated partition as a possibility, acknowledging the Turkish Cypriot right to self-determination. Greece pushed for island-wide self-determination, which Turks feared meant enosis.
What was Turkey's position then?
Initially defending the status quo, but as things deteriorated, Turkey also began to raise partition as a potential outcome based on the realities on the ground. The conference didn't reach a solution, though.
But later agreements did establish a republic.
Yes, the Zurich and London Agreements of 1959. These led to the independent Republic of Cyprus in 1960. Crucially, it was guaranteed by Turkey, Greece, and the UK.
What were the founding principles?
Independence, a partnership between the two communities, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and communal autonomy. The UK gave up sovereignty but kept its military bases.
Sounds like a workable compromise on paper. Did it hold?
According to the sources, no. They state that Greek Cypriot leaders didn't stick to the agreements, continuing to push for a gnosis, which undermined the partnership and peace. The Turkish government apparently issued repeated warnings about these violations.
Okay. Now, around the same time, Turkey was also looking towards Europe economically, the EEC.
Right, the European Economic Community, AET in Turkish back then. Turkey applied for association in 1959. Interestingly, this was triggered by Greece applying first, showing that competitive dynamic, but also a clear desire from Turkey to be part of the Western European project.
Did the EC accept?
Yes. The Council accepted both applications in September 59, mindful of that delicate Turkey-Greece balance. Talks began.
But then the 1960 coup in Turkey happened. Impact.
Major impact. Relations stalled, negotiations were postponed indefinitely, and the sources say that sensitive balance between Turkey and Greece was disrupted, putting Turkey at a disadvantage.
Did things get back on track?
Eventually, yes. The post-coup military government reaffirmed Turkey's Western path, and the later CHP government saw EEC ties as part of the broader Westernization goal, not just economics.
Leading to the Ankara Agreement.
Exactly. Signed in 1963, came into force end of 64. This agreement specifically set full membership as the ultimate goal. The sources note the relationship has been volatile since then, lots of ups and downs, but Turkey has never really abandoned that long-term perspective of membership.
Okay, let's look at the 60s and 70s. The Cold War context is shifting.
Yeah, moving from the peak tension of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, remember, involved those Jupiter missiles in Turkey, towards a period of relative detente. The Red Phone hotline was set up in '63, less direct confrontation, more management.
How did this affect U.S.-Turkey relations?
Became a bit trickier. The U.S. was bogged down in Vietnam, dealing with the Soviets reaching nuclear parity. The sources suggest the U.S. wasn't always perceived as considering Turkey's interests fully. The unilateral decision on the Jupiter missiles is given as an example. This created some trust issues.
But Turkey started looking elsewhere too, towards the USSR.
Yes, a noticeable normalization began. The first high-level meeting since 1939 was in New York, 1960, between the Turkish foreign minister and Khrushchev. Then the Turkish parliament speaker visited Moscow in '63.
A real thaw.
Seemed like it. A big turning point was Foreign Minister Feridun Samal Erkin's visit to Moscow in 1964, the first FM visit in 25 years. They signed a cultural scientific cooperation agreement.
What was the tone of these improving relations?
The joint statement emphasized things like territorial integrity, independence, respecting differences, developing friendly ties focused on culture, trade. The sources stress this wasn't a military alignment like NATO. Interestingly, they also apparently found common ground on Cyprus during this period.
And these contacts continued.
Yes, more high-level visits. Soviet Premier Kosygin and Turkish PM Demirel met in '66-67. Even though Demirel's party was generally more cautious about the USSR than Ecevit's, ties developed. An economic technical cooperation agreement in '67, President Sunay visited in '69.
So a clear trend towards a more diversified foreign policy.
Exactly. A multi-directional approach was emerging in the '60s. But then, the sources note, the 1971 military intervention in Turkey interrupted this shift.
What happened after 71 into the 70s?
Domestically, a turbulent period. Lots of short-lived coalition governments, intense right-left political conflict. This instability naturally spilled over into foreign policy. Ecevit's center-left governments sometimes took stances critical of the U.S., while Demirel's center-right governments were more traditionally anti-Soviet.
But the global trend of detente continued.
It did through much of the '70s, less focus on the arms race. This was reflected in Ecevit's approach, emphasizing regional ties, mutual trust over military buildup. His governments also talked about closer ties with the Third World, newly independent nations. AP governments, too, stressed relations with neighbors, including the Middle East.
What drove this push for diversification, especially towards the Middle East?
Two key things mentioned. First, the ongoing tensions with the U.S. after the Cyprus intervention and the arms embargo. Second, and perhaps more importantly according to the sources, sheer economic necessity after the 1973 oil crisis hit hard. Turkey needed better economic ties with oil-producing Middle Eastern countries.
But this wasn't abandoning the West.
No, the sources are clear on this. It wasn't an alternative to the U.S.-NATO relationship, but a strategic move away from sole dependency. Diversification, not replacement. They even note that while the U.S. arms embargo hurt, Turkey didn't necessarily break with NATO over it, often blaming the U.S. Congress rather than the administration.
Okay, let's delve into the 1974 Cyprus peace operations. The background, as the sources reiterate, was violations of the 1960 agreements by Greek Cypriots aiming for enosis.
Yes, and repeated warnings from Turkey. The material states Turkey's military intervention was justified by a coup in Cyprus aimed at achieving enosis, which threatened the constitutional order and Turkish Cypriots.
So the first operation happened, then negotiations.
Right. First operation, then the first Geneva negotiations. A key outcome cited is a declaration finding Turkey's intervention justified and accepting Turkish Cypriot autonomy. This is presented as a diplomatic success for Turkey at that stage.
But then there was a second operation. Why?
The Second Geneva talks stalled on the constitutional details. Turkey proposed a federal state with a Turkish Cypriot zone covering about 34% of the north. There was some suggestion of cantonal borders, too. But Greece and the Greek Cypriots asked for more time, which Turkey saw as stalling, leading them to launch the second operation to secure the area.
When was the second operation?
August 14, 1974. The Turkish armed forces took control of roughly 40% of the island.
How was the international reaction to this second phase? Different.
Very different, according to the sources. Unlike the first operation, the second one was not generally accepted as legitimate internationally. It was often described as an occupation.
And the consequences?
Significant. The U.S. imposed that arms embargo we mentioned. Turkey faced international isolation. But this, ironically perhaps, further pushed Turkey to build ties with the USSR and regional states, deepening that multi-directional policy out of necessity.
And the Cyprus issue led to other problems with Greece.
Yes. Tensions spilled over into the Aegean Sea. Disputes spilled over into the Aegean Sea. Disputes flared up over the continental shelf, territorial water limits, air traffic control zones, FIR line, and general airspace issues. These became recurring points of friction.
Moving into the 1980s, another military coup in Turkey in 1980.
Yes, the sources describe it as repeating the 1960 pattern. Civilian politics suspended due to extreme right-left violence, instability, assassinations, economic crisis, deadlock over electing a president. This period, the material notes, led to setbacks in foreign policy, with minimal activity until civilian rule returned in '83.
And the 1980s become largely associated with Turgut Özal.
Very much so. Prime Minister from '83 to '89, then President until '93. His era is characterized by his strong personality and a much more proactive, dynamic foreign policy style. He apparently often clashed with the traditional bureaucracy, the military, foreign ministry, even opposition within his own party who he felt were too cautious, too stuck in the status quo.
He saw changes coming globally.
Yes, he's credited with foresight, seeing the Cold War was ending and preparing Turkey for it. He saw a huge opportunity, especially in the former Soviet regions. There's a quote attributed to him about a vast area from the Balkans to Central Asia opening up, a historic chance for Turkey.
How were U.S. relations during the 80-83 military rule?
Relatively smooth, the sources suggest. NATO was the key framework. But there was a significant strategic misstep mentioned regarding the Rogers Plan.
What was that?
General Evren, leading the military government, apparently lifted Turkey's veto on Greece rejoining NATO's military wing based only on a verbal promise from U.S. General Rogers about command areas. No written guarantees.
Bad Greece.
The Papandreou government, elected in '81, just rejected the verbal deal and kept Greek forces under national command, exploited the lack of a written agreement, highlighted as a weakness in negotiation during that period.
But under Özal as PM, 83 to 89, U.S. ties improved significantly.
Described as the brightest days, Özal actively cultivated very close relations, hoping for U.S. reciprocity. His big goal, according to the material, was using U.S. influence to counter Armenian and Greek lobbying efforts in the U.S. regarding 1915 and Cyprus. He believed U.S. support was essential to solve these problems.
Did he feel he got enough U.S. support?
The sources suggest U.S. aid levels in the 80s weren't always deemed satisfactory by Turkey, despite Özal's efforts.
There's an interesting quote about Özal comparing the U.S. and Europe.
Yes, it captures his thinking. He saw the U.S. as pragmatic, looking for solutions. Europe, he felt, was biased, stuck on history, always siding with Greece on Cyprus. He worried Cyprus would fall under European sway without strong U.S. backing. The U.S. interest, in his view, was pragmatic too. Prevent a Turkey-Greece conflict, secure bases, seeing Cyprus strategically like an aircraft carrier.
This context helps understand his stance in the Gulf War, 1990-91. Described as controversial.
Very controversial. The sources say Özal took a very open, maybe even risky pro-U.S. stance, making sacrifices that perhaps weren't even asked for. This put him at odds with his own military chief, who resigned, his defense minister, and foreign minister.
What did Turkey actually do?
Allowed the U.S. to use Incirlik Air Base for operations, fully implemented UN sanctions on Iraq, and crucially shut down the Kirkuk-Yumurtalık oil pipeline, a big economic hit. But Turkey didn't send combat troops.
What were the results for Turkey, according to the sources?
Mostly negative, they argue. Turkey didn't get the specific gains it hoped for. There were security and economic downsides. A key negative outcome highlighted is the power vacuum in northern Iraq after the war.
How did that affect Turkey?
It allowed the PKK to set up camps and training bases there, significantly strengthening the group. The PKK problem became internationalized, used as leverage against Turkey by various countries, including some allies. Instead of getting support against terrorism, Turkey faced more Western criticism, and its EU application was rejected around this time too.
How did Turkey handle the earlier Iran-Iraq War, 1980-88, a different approach?
Completely different. Strict neutrality and balance. Maintained ties with both sides despite pressure. Focused on boosting trade with both Iran and Iraq, and insisted the Kirkuk-Yumurtalık pipeline and border crossings remain open, which they did. Non-interference was the principle.
Okay, into the 1990s. The Cold War is over, USSR dissolved. Big changes.
Huge changes. Özal's foresight is mentioned again here. That opportunity he saw in the post-Soviet space Balkans to Central Asia became reality. Turkey sought closer U.S. ties in this new era, acting with more self-confidence now the Soviet threat was gone.
Did the U.S. encourage Turkey's role in Central Asia?
Yes, the sources say the U.S. did encourage Turkey to be active there, sharing that Adriatic to China vision. But this early optimism faded.
Why?
Reality set in around 93-95. Russia reasserted its influence strongly in its near abroad. Turkey's initial enthusiasm turned to realism, maybe disappointment. Trying to challenge the status quo led to friction with Russia. Turkey realized the limits of its own power and had to adopt a policy that didn't exclude Moscow.
How were relations with Iran in the 90s?
Characterized by competition. Iran worried about Turkey trying to establish Turkish hegemony in Central Asia. Turkey worried about Iran trying to export its religious regime, especially earlier in the decade.
What about the Balkans? Yugoslavia was breaking up.
Intense activity there too, given historical ties. The main focus was the Bosnia War, 93-96.
What was Turkey's role regarding Bosnia?
After Bosnia declared independence and faced aggression from Bosnian Serbs backed by Serbia Milosevic's Great Serbia idea, Turkey pushed hard for international action. The sources mention genocide against Bosniak Muslims, with 250,000 killed, while Europe seemed to hesitate.
What action did Turkey propose?
Joint action via NATO, UN, OSCE, OIC. Specifically, a NATO-led military operation against the Serbs. But some European countries opposed it, delaying intervention for a long time. Diplomatic efforts were slow and frustrating.
Domestically, the 90s were unstable in Turkey.
Yes, lots of coalition governments after Özal Demirel became president. Political and economic instability led to some foreign policy drift, uncertain priorities.
And the PKK issue? Still prominent.
Extremely prominent, became a major internal and foreign policy challenge. Governments focused heavily on military solutions, which, the sources argue, increased the military's influence in politics, even beyond security matters by the 2000s.
Did the PKK issue affect relations with neighbors?
Massively, especially Syria between 1995. Hafiz Est was harboring the PKK, making provocative statements about Turkish territory. Suleiman shot Hatay. Things got so bad, they almost went to war in 1998.
But Öcalan was captured.
Yes, in Kenya in 1999, after Syria finally expelled him under pressure. That provided huge psychological relief in Turkey, but the underlying PKK problem, its regional network, didn't disappear.
How were U.S. relations during this period post-Özal?
Continued the close ties somewhat, but maybe less dynamic. The U.S. encouragement for Turkey in Central Asia is noted again. But crucially, the sources flagged the PKK issue, and particularly its Syrian offshoot, the PYD, as a future source of major tension with the U.S.
In Europe, the EU customs union happened.
Yes, came into force January 1st, 1996. A big deal, first time a non-member had such deep economic integration. Seen partly as fulfilling earlier promises from the Ankara Agreement, maybe also as compensation for the stalled membership bid. It required aligning with EU rules on goods, competition, tariffs, etc. Dialogue on full membership continued, but progress remained slow.
Right, which brings us to the AKP period from 2002 onwards. How is this era characterized initially, say, up to 2011?
As a period of very proactive foreign policy, based on this idea of Turkey as a merkez ülke, a central country, a regional hub. And the key enabler for this, according to the sources, was finally achieving domestic political and economic stability after years of shaky coalitions.
That domestic stability was key.
Seen as the main reason, yes. The AKP came in after previous parties were seen to have failed, won strong public support, and provided long-term single-party government. This apparently gave them the confidence and capacity for a more active foreign policy.
And the initial focus was heavily on the Middle East.
Yes, given special importance. Seen through a lens of history, culture, religion, not just geopolitics, Turkey got deeply involved in regional developments from 2002, aiming to be a major influencer.
How were relations pre-Arab Spring, roughly 2000 through 2010?
Generally very good, especially with Syria, interestingly. Ties warmed after the 2003 Iraq invasion, partly over shared concerns about Kurdish autonomy in Iraq. Syria cracked down on the PKK, somewhat, extradited members. Turkey mediated between Israel and Syria, supported Syria against international pressure sometimes.
The golden years.
That phrase is used, yeah, especially from 2009 onwards. You saw joint military drills, visa waivers with neighbors, even joint cabinet meetings with Syria in 2010 looked like a strategic partnership emerging. The idea was no game can be set up in the Middle East without Turkey. Palestine was also a major focus.
But then came the Arab Spring in 2011, a major turning point.
Huge turning point. Relations across the region basically turned upside down, worsened dramatically.
Particularly with Syria.
Especially Syria. As regimes fell elsewhere, Turkey became sharply critical of Bashar al-Assad's brutal crackdown on protests, explicitly calling for him to leave power. Events in Syria were now seen as directly impacting Turkey's own security.
And this marked a shift in Turkey's approach.
Definitely. From relying more on soft power, diplomacy, economic ties, towards incorporating hard power, became much more security-focused, especially regarding the southern border.
The Syrian conflict didn't stay regional, did it?
No, it quickly became internationalized. Global players, the US, Russia, got heavily involved, turned into a complex proxy war, a power struggle described by some analysts here as a new Cold War. And despite all the players, little progress towards a solution, leaving neighbors like Turkey bearing the brunt, especially with refugees.
And the conflict created space for groups like ISIS.
Exactly. ISIS took advantage of the chaos. Turkey found itself heavily engaged in counterterrorism, facing attacks on its own soil.
This is where the tension with the U.S. really escalated over the YPG-PYD.
Yes, a major point of friction. Despite being NATO allies, the U.S. partnered with the YPG, which the sources consistently linked to the PKK and referred to as PKK-PYD, to fight ISIS on the ground in Syria, providing them military aid, weapons. Turkey vehemently opposed this, seeing the YPG as a direct extension of the PKK and a security threat. Created a deep rift.
How did relations with Iran play out during this period?
Primarily defined by competition, especially over Syria. They backed opposite sides, Turkey supporting opposition groups, Iran backing the Assad regime. There was also tension over the NATO missile defense radar placed at Karachi in Turkey in 2011. Iran threatened to hit it if attacked.
So Turkey-U.S. relations post-2011, pretty rocky.
Very rocky. The sources list numerous crises. The first March 2003 vote in Turkey's parliament blocking U.S. troops for Iraq, the S-400 missile purchase from Russia, the PKK-PYD issue, the Hawk Bank case, Pastor Brunson's detention, being kicked out of the F-35 program. Lots of tension.
But efforts to manage it.
Yes. Periods where things settled, efforts to de-escalate. The sources suggest stable relations require the U.S. to be more sensitive to Turkey's core interests and concerns, not just impose its views. They argue losing Turkey's influence in the region would be costly for the U.S., especially with Iran being a factor. Turkey's approach is described as persistent on its interests, pushing things close to crisis but trying not to go over the edge.
And Russia. How did those relations evolve, especially post-2011?
Became heavily focused on energy, a dynamic favoring Russia due to Turkey's growing needs. Big pipeline projects like Blue Stream, Turk Stream, and the Akuyu nuclear power plant awarded to Russia.
That nuclear plant was significant.
Highly significant. Erdogan and Putin attending the groundbreaking in 2018 is highlighted as showing its importance, despite EU and domestic opposition. Energy security is key. Though US-EU-backed pipelines like BTC, BTE, TANAP provided some balance to Russia's energy weight.
How did Turkey's official language about the Middle East change after the Arab Spring?
Noticeably, less emphasis on just historical cultural ties, more focus on stability, security, peace, explicitly linking regional developments directly to Turkey's own security and stability. The quote is something like, "Developments in the Middle East closely concern Turkey due to direct and indirect effects, a much more security-driven framing."
And this influenced the stance on Assad.
Yes, especially as the crackdown intensified and millions of Syrian refugees poured into Turkey. Turkey's position hardened, urging the regime to listen to the opposition.
Okay, so looking back across all this material, it's quite a journey.
It really is. From Ottoman decline and external pressures, through the Republic's founding focus on Statikokuluk, consolidating the state. Then that huge post-WWII pivot west, joining NATO, dealing with all the complexities that brought bases, Cyprus.
Then the attempts at a more multi-directional policy in the 60s and 70s, navigating detentes, regional crises, internal coups and instability, Erzul's distinctive era, and those recurring challenges, Cyprus, the PKK, constantly shaping things.
And finally, the AKP era's initial proactive center country ambition, followed by the massive disruption of the Arab Spring, forcing adaptation and navigating those really complex, often tense relationships with the US, Russia, Iran, and its neighbors.
It's a history, as the sources laid out, profoundly shaped by its geography, its internal politics, constant external pressures, and this ongoing effort to figure out and pursue national interests in a world that never stops changing.
A real story of adaptation, trying to navigate incredibly complex currents decade after decade.
Absolutely. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Given this deep well of experience managing external powers, internal vulnerabilities, constantly adjusting to new realities. How do those historical lessons, those ingrained patterns, continue to shape the way Turkey approaches foreign policy decisions today?
What does this long, often turbulent history tell us about how Turkey navigates the equally complex, multipolar world we find ourselves in right now? That's definitely something to ponder.